Hi everyone. I can see that the number of participants are increasing as I speak. I'm just going to kind of soft pedal for 30 seconds or so to allow the numbers to grow a little bit further, and then we will proceed with the formal events of this afternoon. My name is Andrew Fagan. I am director of the Human Rights Centre. This is the second, I believe, or maybe even the third of our Human Rights Centre speaker series events. It's obviously incredibly timely because our focus is upon the environment, upon global warming and human rights. And clearly, as I'm sure we are all aware by now, this coincides with COP26, which is an incredibly important landmark and event, and we hope a successful one, although some of our speakers will take perhaps slightly different and more critical views upon that. So yeah, let me get to the, as I say, the more kind of formal matter. This is entitled The Climate and Ecological Emergency, Global Crisis and Essex Action. As you're aware, I'm sure, the 26th UN Climate Change Conference is taking place in Glasgow as we speak, with the focus and the emphasis to accelerate action towards the goals of realizing the Paris Agreement and the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Centre for Environment and Society and Human Rights Centre at Essex University are hosting this panel event, Climate and Ecological Emergency, Global Crisis, Essex Action, to coincide with COP26. The panels, and we have two of them, provide insights into the research, teaching and activism by members of the Essex University community across several disciplines, responding to the climate and ecological emergency. Just in terms of how we'll proceed, we are scheduled to run until 3:30. There are two panels. I am chairing the first panel and my colleague Kellen will be chairing the second panel. We anticipate the first panel to conclude around about 2:30. We will then have a 5-minute break to give everyone a chance to refresh themselves and then proceed with the second panel. You'll be able to answer questions obviously through the Q&A facility in time-honored fashion on Zoom throughout, but I would encourage you to raise your questions towards the end of each panel when our final speaker in each panel has concluded their particular presentation. I'm delighted that a senior colleague from the university, the Deputy Vice Chancellor Lorna Fox-Amani, is here to make some opening comments about underlining Essex University's commitment to tackling climate change. Lorna, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to all of our colleagues who are contributing to this important event today. In an age of crises, the climate crisis is undeniably one of the biggest threats that the world is facing right now. And every day we're seeing more evidence of the widespread environmental and social damage that the climate crisis is leading to. Here at the University of Essex, we know that time is running out to act. And this is why in 2020, we declared a climate and ecological emergency, signalling our commitment to take action for change, to make the difference that we need to slow climate change before it's too late. In June and July of this year, our University Senate and Council approved the university's new sustainability sub-strategy, which will run from 2021 to 26. And in this sub-strategy, we set out the steps that we will take in order to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2035. This is our second sustainability sub-strategy. We've already made progress on a wide range of fronts, reducing our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 28% against the 2005 baseline. But we recognise that in order to make the next big push to net zero, we're going to need to make very significant changes to our ways of working, and that it's vital that we make those changes now. So alongside our commitment to net zero carbon emissions, our sustainability sub-strategy sets out a wide range of focus areas, from biodiversity and water management through to waste and recycling, travel and transport, and food. We've also set out our priorities in relation to education for sustainability and growing our research to support the enhancement and protection of the environment, while ensuring that research is conducted in ways that minimise our own environmental impact. We know that in order to meet the challenges that we're facing today, we're going to need to make progress on a wide range of fronts. So, for example, we're proud to be working in partnership with Global Citizen, a movement that's inspiring and empowering millions of people around the world to learn and to act in support of the most critical issues facing humanity. And next week, we've got an important event to explore together with Global Citizen what we all need to do to deliver on our commitments and achieve the changes that we so urgently need. We hope that the work that we're doing will help to inspire and empower our communities to take decisive action. Indeed, the scale of commitment across our Essex communities to take action for climate recovery is phenomenal. The university has a very considerable role to play in tackling climate and ecological change, and our researchers, our educators, our staff and our students are absolutely at the heart of this. So I'm absolutely delighted that we're holding this event this afternoon. I want to say a really big thank you to all of our colleagues who are leading the way in helping us to think about the actions that we can take individually, collectively, through our research, through our education, and as an organisation to be part of the solutions. So that was all I wanted to say, Andrew, by way of introduction, and happy to hand back to you and to wish colleagues well for a really interesting and important webinar this afternoon.
Thank you, Lorna. Thank you so much. And obviously, thank you for the university's continuing commitment to such an urgent issue. Thank you, Lorna. Okay, let's go without further ado to our first panel, which has the title Researching Climate Change, Interdisciplinary Perspectives. We're all aware, I'm sure, that climate change has far-ranging consequences for all of us and raises very many questions across a whole range of different disciplines, including law, of course, but many other disciplines too. I'll be chairing this event. We are, hopefully our speakers will stick relatively closely to a 15 minutes maximum time on each of their presentations. We have 3 speakers from across the Human Rights Centre and the university. Beginning with Dr. Lisa Blackmore, who is Senior Lecturer in the School of Philosophy and Art History, and also based in the Interdisciplinary Studies Centre, and also a member of the Human Rights Centre. Lisa's very evocative title to her talk is Give a Shit, How Activist Art Infiltrated the Toilets at COP21. Lisa will be followed by my colleague, Dr. Stephen Turner, who's a Senior Lecturer in the School of Again, a member of the Human Rights Centre. Stephen is going to confront us with a rather challenging presentation, which is, and he's entitled, his presentation is entitled Why COP26 Won't Work, not due to the efforts of Boris Johnson, I assume, Stephen. And then finally, Dr. Bersha Odar, who's a lecturer in the School of Law, member of the Human Rights Centre, will be speaking to a presentation entitled Objection, Your Honour, the Planet's Burning Up, the Climate Litigation Insurgency. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to pass over the floor to Lisa. Lisa, you have roughly 15 minutes or so, just to remind all of our participants that you'll be able to ask questions throughout, but if you could reserve your questions to the 15 minutes that we will have at the end of the 3 panelists' presentations, that would be very helpful. Okay, thank you. Lisa, the floor is yours. Give a shit, why should we?
Thank you, Andrew, and it's a real pleasure to be at this talk today and to be able to share with you some of the research and education initiatives that we work on from the Essex collection of art from Latin America. So as Andrew said, I work in art history and the Interdisciplinary Studies Centre, and we're really interested in the ways in which artworks from this amazing collection can intersect with and spark conversations across our community, both in the classroom but also through the research we do. So what I want to do today is tell you about an artwork that has just been included into this conversation that we have between artworks in the Scala collection, and to reflect a little bit on how it came to be, the role of art in opening public fora for thinking critically about the limitations of events like COP, and to tell you a little bit about the artist who produced it. So this is a brand new artwork for me as well. So this is a great opportunity to share some of the sort of research that we do to begin unpacking the stories of these pieces as they get woven into the collection, and then can start a dialogue with other works. And we've been working on a new collection theme within Escala for the last 2-3 years, basically, which is centered around the environment. So looking at the holdings of the collection and thinking about how they help us to consider human relations to nature over a long period, and not just in Latin America, but intersecting with global concerns. So the artwork that you're going to learn about today is by a Peruvian artist called Teresa Borracino, but she's actually based currently in the Netherlands. And there she is one of the directors of a group called Fossil Free Culture, NL. So based in the Netherlands, this is a collective of artists, researchers, and other members who are involved in the way in which art can trigger debate, polemic around the intersection of art and climate activism. And more specifically, what this group works to do is to confront the sponsorship of public cultural institutions in the Netherlands from sources of financing that come from the oil and gas industry. So in that sense, we can intersect different geographies and forms of activism, similar to the work of other groups like Liberate Tate, and map a sort of geography of ways in which art intersects with broader climate debates and public spheres. So what was Give a Shit? Give a Shit was a project that Teresa Borracino created for COP21, and it made a really impassioned case for the science of climate change, and for the predictions of the modelling of the IPCC reports that were talking about the 2 degree and 1.5 degree thresholds. And so what she did was to take that report and to print it on toilet rolls. And these toilet rolls were then circulated in the Netherlands among members of the parliament. Every new Senate member who had voted against the new energy law there received one of these rolls of toilet paper challenging their position on these energy laws. More globally, these rolls were circulated to people who were in Paris for COP21 and smuggled into the loos of Le Bourget on a particular day at a particular time. And so they had this impact on all of those members of the summit who were taking a comfort break, as we now call it in our Zoom world, to the plenary halls and to be confronted with the science. And she kind of very provocatively also says, in some of the materials that were circulated with this project are our leaders wiping their asses with the science. So really kind of engaging in this very ironic language and thinking about art as creating an impact, not about as making objects, but as really contributing to important global debates. And as I say, I'm particularly interested in this artist because of the connection with Latin America, which is where a lot of my own research is focused, in and around the history of human relations to the environment, and particular ways in which artists have offered us ways of thinking critically about the sorts of industrial and extractive paradigms that set upon natural resources for profit, and that come into real conflict with other forms of respect and coexistence and collaboration with the environment that are present in ancestral traditions there. So the year before Borracino made Give a Shit, she participated in a residency project run by Susie Killen and Maxim Holland in Peru. It's called Hawaipi, and it's been going for about 10 years now. And what Maxi and Susie do every year is they decide a site-specific place where they'll invite Peruvian but also international artists to come together for a quite extended period of time and to make site-specific artworks that reflect on these places. So they've done projects in post-earthquake scenarios, in mining areas of the Amazon, in post-conflict communities in Colombia. And in 2014, they made the decision to take this group of artists to Pariacaca, which is a glacier out in the Sierra Central, in the central highlands of Peru. And it is the single most important source of water for the city of Lima, the capital of Peru. And they did this strategically because they knew that that same year in December 2014, COP20 was going to be hosted in Lima. And so this was a way of creating a dialogue with communities who were being affected at the source of receding glaciers that were not only affecting the availability of water much further downriver in the capital, but were directly affecting those campesinos, so peasant and farmer communities who are living alongside these sources of water, and also seeing a lot of privatization of their water sources, the intervention of hydroelectric infrastructure in their water sources. So kind of broadening out from this question of climate change also to other issues that are interrelated in terms of the forms of industry that consider water to be a resource that can be privatized and commodified and enclosed. So Teresa Borracino, as I said, was part of this group that uprooted and for a period of time were developing works in and around the glacier and thinking about the particular kind of vulnerability. So Peru has 71% of the world's tropical glaciers. It's a huge repository of frozen water, and its economy depends heavily on water resources. So agriculture alone takes 86% of the country's water use. It employs 65% of the rural workforce and 23% of the national workforce. So water is this absolutely strategic backbone for the national economy. So, you know, alongside agriculture, there's mining, there's tourism, but it really demands provision of water. So the Peruvian Water Authority carried out a new national inventory of glaciers and glacial lakes from 1970 to 2007, and they found that the total glaciers in the Central Cordillera had decreased by 56%. So this is a huge decrease in glaciers that's affecting these communities and more broadly the national population. And it's a trend that is replicated across other glacial landscapes in the Andes. So this is a broader regional concern. So what did Teresa Borracino do as part of this residency project? Well, she reflected on the optics of the summit that was occurring in Lima from this very remote place where they were holding the residency on the foot of the Glacier Pariacaca. So on the top, you can see a shot from Google Maps that has a little red pin where the glacier is, and down on the coast you can see the city of Lima. And of course, like, we're looking at a really arid landscape. Something like 70% of Peru's population lives in Lima and is you know, nestled in this desert city and really needing water that is being brought down from this glacier. But at the same time, the kind of demands from the city, although they tend to be heard a lot, what Borracino did was reflect also on the way in which peasant voices in the highlands themselves were not being heard and not really having a presence in this major event, the summit down in the capital. So she did something quite simple. She decided to assemble these plastic chairs at the foot of one of these glacial lakes and establish her own Pseudosummit. That was the name of the artwork produced. And she describes it as an intervention at the foot of Pariacaca, a glacier located in the central Andes between the provinces of Lima and Junín. And the chairs from the assembly of the Tanta peasants community in Yauyos region were placed to stage an empty auditorium. While the world leaders gathered to negotiate in the capital's convention center, the real melting planet remains unattended. So of course, This was an artwork that nobody saw, of course, except for the artists who were participating, but whose life, its afterlife, is in the form of this photograph and an online publication, and the exhibition of the artworks produced during this residency, which was then presented in Lima. But because I'm aware that probably there will be misgivings about how much impact this kind of artwork could have, I want just to briefly show you, and I'm aware of the time, a parallel activity that took place that she organized at the same time called Futuro, Caliente, Hot Future. And it was an ongoing project which opened up a space in Lima at the same time as the COP talks were happening, and brought people together to think across a space of 4 days for dialogue and exchange between citizens, negotiators, activists, climate change specialists, entrepreneurs and artists. So like a really broad section of stakeholders who had an interest in thinking together about the pressures of climate change and potential actions. So this public forum consisted of an open space that was entirely built with waste, so paper, cardboard, plastic bags and timber. And what it did was host a series of conversations and workshops, which was designed by the artists together with Elisenda Estrems and Marcial Delgado. So this is part of Teresa Borosino's ongoing work. Her artist website charts all of these different projects, and it's something, as I say, this is a really new artwork for us. It's just formed part of the collection. The way it entered this collection is quite interesting as well, but perhaps a story for another day. So just to conclude, I'd like to invite you to explore the collection theme of the environment. We've got an incredible selection of artworks there, and also our students have been writing really interesting and sharp critical texts reflecting on human nature relationships in a sort of broader framework. So that can all be accessed through the Escala website. And Borosino's collective is called fossilfreeculture.nl. That's the website where you can find out more about their activities. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your contribution to this particular event. There are certain disciplines and narratives that we know tend to dominate this particular sphere in this particular field, and art is not always front and center. So it's crucial and vital that art and the media more broadly plays a fundamental role. So thank you so much, Lisa. Stephen, okay, why COP26 isn't going to work? It's you're gonna let us down easily, I hope. But over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you to the organisers, to Andrew, to Katia, and particularly Jude Buena de Mesquita for organising the event and for the opportunity to join in with this discussion. What I'm going to do is talk about this theme of why COP26 won't work, and it's really a critical appraisal of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change system. And hopefully by making critical appraisals of these types of systems, we can look at ways that they can be improved for the future and work more effectively. So the idea is not just to be critical, but also to have a positive effect through the research that we do. So I'm going to share my screen now to put some slides up, and we'll go through those and talk about this this topic. Let's see, let's just expand that out. So why COP26 won't work? And as I say, the idea is to understand critically or to think critically about the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the system within which it sits, and the pitfalls of adopting the approach that the international community does through that type of system. And so I'm going to posit three real reasons why there are these drawbacks to such a system. One, that it relies on a very old system of international law, of any ancient system of international law. Also that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change system doesn't actually address the root causes that are built into the international economic framework that allows for and facilitates the production of greenhouse gases and the emission of greenhouse gases. And then also to focus on the fact that the agenda through that system is very much state-centered. It's very much a country-by-country system focused on the governments of those countries. So we'll have a look at this, and by looking at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and where it comes from and how it operates, we have to consider it within the context of international law and the way that international law operates. And so if we trace back the current system of so-called international law, we go back to the Treaty of Westphalia here, 1648, and the idea is that you bring together the leaders of these countries, you bring together the leaders or the representatives of those countries, and as leaders of sovereign states, with each state having its own sovereign territory, they can address international issues between them by cooperation and engaging into treaties. So that all sounds quite familiar, doesn't it? Because that's precisely what we're doing at the moment at COP26. We're bringing together into a hall, just like this room here, maybe a bit bigger, a group of leaders or the representatives of those leaders, with the idea that they can barter and negotiate in terms of this challenge of climate change and come up with agreements between themselves. So the problem with this approach, and there are problems with this approach, is that it's very much state-centered. It's very much focused on those governments. But between 1648 and present day, or even the modern era, the present era, this post-war era, a lot of things have actually happened in terms of the way that business and industry works internationally. We have frameworks of law and systems which govern the way that business and industry works, which really those governments are subject to themselves. They sit as leaders of countries which are subject to that matrix of law, that framework of international economic law, which dictates how business and industry works. And if we start to drill down into that law and look at the legal frameworks, what we find is corporate law, we find international trade law, we find international insurance law, international finance law, we find international investment law, and the list can go on, international banking law, and so forth. And within these frameworks of law, there are regulations and a status through which businesses operate, and within that system of business, all of the companies in the world that are in different sectors are in competition with each other. So what we have is a situation where the framework of power has actually changed a lot since the 17th century. And whereas maybe in the 17th century, states really were all powerful and kings and queens were all powerful and governments were all powerful, a lot has happened to change that. And so we move into this era, especially since the Second World War, where globalization has taken place, and these frameworks of economic laws and systems through which business and trade operate really dictate to a large extent how businesses compete within that within the international competitive arena within which they have to compete. So if we go back to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and we come back to COP26, there is clearly serious and sincere intent amongst many parties and governments to achieve these pledges and these reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, so that the international community can move forward in terms of climate change. However, the tradition that's adopted and the way that the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change operates is that the focus is back on those countries, is back on those governments for them to reduce the emissions of their respective countries. And there is very little focus on addressing the international framework of laws through economics that dictate the way that businesses have to compete with each other in that international marketplace. And by expecting governments to simply reduce their emissions, what we are effectively doing is expecting governments to do something which can be counterintuitive by limiting the chances, for example, of companies to compete within that international system by placing pressure on the companies in individual state jurisdictions, which puts potentially a handbrake on them. There is the disincentive for countries to actually make those pledges. And what we don't really have within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change system is a focus on that international framework of law which dictates the arena within which companies and businesses operate and trade. So what we see, if we look back over the period through which the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change has been active over the last 30 years, we see this difficulty that governments have in making these pledges in terms of reducing the emissions in their own countries, because it's counterintuitive to, on the one hand, seek to develop your industry, but then also to hamper the companies within your jurisdiction by placing these limitations. And that's part of the reason why obviously countries find it difficult to make these commitments. And we see this especially going back through some of the past COPs. If you go back to one of the big ones where there was a lot of rhetoric at the time, Copenhagen in 2009, where a lot of the scientists, the NGOs, and in the newspapers have said, this is our last chance. This is the last chance that we have to address this issue. We're reaching this tipping point. And yet still the focus is on governments making these pledges and these commitments. So I think what we're now starting to see is that governments and the international community is starting to see that taking this approach will get us so far, but it won't get us all of the way. And by addressing the root causes of the way that the international economic system contributes to the emission of greenhouse gases, then we are potentially going to be in a better position as we can create a level playing field for all businesses in relation to that framework within which they operate. So that means addressing corporate law, it means addressing international trade law, insurance law, international investment law, and so forth. And if that shift starts to happen, then I believe that progress can be made a lot quicker than it is at the moment under the existing approach. Now, what is interesting is we are starting to see some of these types of developments taking place. So even today, you have Mark Carney talking about this coalition of investment companies and institutions coming together to create pledges and commitments in terms of where funds and investments are placed to restrict the investment that takes place in harmful activities, i.e. those that cause greenhouse gas emissions. So we're starting to see this recognition taking place. And what I suggest needs to happen with future COPs and the UNFCCC approach anyway, is that there is this attention to this global system of international economic law, because it's my contention that it contains many aspects of the root causes of what cause greenhouse gas emissions for the international community. Just finally, final note, you may think, well, why is Stephen Turner here talking within a discussion about human rights and talking about all of these issues? Well, I've been concerned, my research has been concerned with human rights and environmental issues over the last 20 years. And it's been my contention in my work that to truly address the human rights impacts that are represented by climate change, and it is a human rights issue, we do need to address the international economic system that causes and is at the heart of many of these problems. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Stephen, thank you. And thank you for suggesting ways forward and constructive ways forward. Yeah, sometimes it's very difficult to see how we move forward. But yes, Stephen, thank you so much. Without further ado, time as ever is against us. I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Bersha Oada. Bersha, you're going to be speaking about environmental litigation insurgencies. And litigation and insurgency aren't two terms you always put together. So fascinating to hear your perspective upon this. Bersha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. I am just going to try and share my screen as well. Just give me a second. Okay, so the title of my my talk is Objection, Your Honor, the planet is burning up. What the context of this is the fact that there's been a rapid increase in insurgency, as I entitled it, where litigation has been brought on climate change grounds. So in 2015, a farmer sued the Pakistani government, alleging that the inaction of the government to address climate change was causing him issues with his crops and his rights to a healthy environment. More importantly, it was that kind of rights-based litigation that was successful in what the court did, and the court essentially forced the government to completely transform its climate policies, and which eventually led to a law change. Similarly, just recently, there was a group of youth in Germany who took a case in the German courts to force the German government to address its climate pledges, and saying that the climate pledges were not sufficient. And the court ruled in their favor, forcing the government to essentially address its climate pledges, update its climate pledges rather, to a more ambitious target. It was not just the youth, but we've seen grandmothers in Switzerland, a group of grandmothers who got together to complain, to make a climate complaint against their government. This case is now going to be heard in the European Court. And similarly, groups of youth in Colombia were successful in getting their government or getting the court to force their government to take more action to prevent forest destruction of the the Colombian Amazon on the grounds of climate change. So we've seen this kind of cross-fertilization, this kind of spread of these climate cases, often on similar sorts of grounds of youth, or in the Swiss case, older groups, farmers, and so on, taking action, petitioning the courts to to force their governments to take more action. Now, why is this happening? Well, there's been a surge in litigation, as I said, in the last 10 years, but a lot of it has happened since 2015. What happened in 2015? What happened in 2015? Well, the Paris Agreement was agreed, and that has been, in some ways, the basis to start holding the governments to account by saying that we now have every government needs to contribute a certain amount, and we are to hold temperature increases to at least 2 degrees, if not 1.5 degrees. So that has become the basis for this kind of litigation. And in just the last few years, there have been, since 1986 rather, there has been there's been 800 cases, while in just the last 6 years, that number has been exceeded. So again, this kind of insurgency, as it were, since 2015. And as we've seen this, as the examples I suggested just showed, this has been across different countries. Here in the UK, there have been cases such as the Heathrow Airport case, where climate change was again used as a grounds in that litigation. There's been other litigation essentially to make the UK government pledge a net zero target. It was initially unsuccessful, but then the government did that anyway. So litigation has kind of been a strategy along with political activism to get governments to ramp up their ambition. Why does this matter? Well, as Stephen's talk before me kind of laid out, that governments have to place pledges under the UN treaty system, under the Paris Agreement. The goal is that we hold temperature increases to 1.5 degrees warmer than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. That is seen as a kind of temperature increase that is somewhat manageable. We are already at 1.2 degrees, and various predictions say that we have less than a decade to reach that kind of 1.5 degree target. Current policies, current business as usual, let's say, current climate policies take us to somewhere around 3 to 4 degree warming. So you see that middle part of the diagram there. The pledges and targets that countries have laid out through the UN treaty system, through these COPs and so on, get us to 2.4 degrees. Optimistically, maybe a little bit below that, but it requires still a lot of work. So whatever countries have kind of pledged is far exceeding where we need to get to. Because of that, litigation has been used as a strategy to start to get governments to commit to more ambitious climate reduction, but also in terms of getting governments to address the impacts of climate change. That is, when people are feeling the losses that are coming with climate change, where if they live in coastal areas in the global south and small island states and so on, and getting governments to act so that communities can adapt to climate change. And I'll come to that in a second, because that's the focus of my work. So that's the kind of broader context of climate litigation and why it matters. The other reason it matters, I should say, is that the Paris Agreement itself doesn't actually have an enforcement mechanism. So let's say let's say a country like the UK, Australia, whoever does not commit to the most ambitious climate targets it could, or even a half ambitious climate target. There's no mechanism within the agreement to force it to commit to anything more than it does. All there is the kind of diplomatic pressure that can be put through various mechanisms of reviewing their commitment, saying it's not enough, and so on, and going round and round like that. But there's no top-down mechanism under the international system. Hence, litigation is a way, a bottom-up way for social activists, NGOs, and petitioners, so citizens, to get their governments to act in a more ambitious way. Focus of my research is really litigation in the global south, particularly in South Asia. So communities in the global south are the most affected by climate change, yet have contributed the least to the problem. If we look at, for example, India, where a lot of my work is, in 2019, about half of the country was in various degrees of drought. When you consider about 70% of the population works in the rural areas, and about 80% of those in rural areas are small or marginal farmers, that's millions and millions of people who are being the most affected by climate change and have the least ability to cope with that change. Those impacts are vital to their rights to food, water, healthcare, and an adequate standard of living. And hence climate change and human rights have this kind of inherent interaction. Climate action generally consists of one of two or three things. One is reducing greenhouse gases, which we talked about before. The second part is adaptation, so helping communities to adapt to the changes that are happening, and loss and damage where, for example, a cyclone hits and houses are blown away and so on. Litigation is happening on all three fronts, but what the scholarship around climate litigation is finding is that it's very difficult to identify the second and third, so adaptation, loss and damage. It's very easy to identify a case where someone comes and says, we need to reduce emissions by 20% or whatever. It's more difficult where it's an issue of, let's say, access to water or a food issue or something like that, where climate change plays some part, but isn't the kind of is linked to other processes and structures of how the economy runs, or how social welfare works and so on. So it's a bit different in terms of identifying it as climate litigation. So my research kind of falls in that part and tries to contribute in terms of thinking about adaptation litigation. As I mentioned, because adaptation is inherently linked to development, poverty, and rights, people don't always make climate arguments, even when they could, or even if you could identify it down to climate change. So it's often cases about, as I said, access to water or something like that. And it's linked to various other issues, and climate change doesn't often figure in the case, but yet it is intrinsically also about climate change, because often it's because of a drought, because of a flood or something like that. Because law provides only one part of trying to understand these issues, in my work, I use a lot of political ecology. I think political ecology provides a framework for understanding how people become vulnerable to climate change, and it foregrounds social and political structures that underpin that. So if you take, for example, when a drought occurs, it's not as simple as saying, just because there's less rain, I have less access to water. Often when a drought occurs, what happens is those with more land start to take more water from, let's say, under the ground or the river or wherever. And because the law works in such a way, often in areas like South Asia, that those with land have more legal power over water, they're able to extract more and more water. They also hold, obviously, the wealth, and they also act as money lenders and so on. So there's a lot of debt issues related to droughts in rural areas. And what that means is someone who is the most marginalized person becomes beholden to people who have more relative power to them for water, for credit, as in for money, for work, and so on. So while that person then may migrate to the city or something like that for work, it's not so easy to just say it's climate change. It's also about all of these other areas of law, water law, credit, sort of markets, loans, and so on. So by understanding all of these structural factors that make someone vulnerable, I think it provides a framework for understanding how we can strategize law and litigation to kind of transform the most marginalized people's conditions, recognize their rights, and address the vulnerability that one faces. It opens up several other areas of litigation other than climate litigation that could be looked at, but still within this framework of addressing climate change. So as I mentioned, cases around loans, around workers' rights, around healthcare, around food security, looking at it from a broader perspective of how someone becomes vulnerable when faced with the ongoing impacts of climate change in a sort of 2-degree, 3-degree world. And if there can be some litigation strategies to change the laws and in these areas, then that can do a lot of good. So some of my work has been kind of published recently. If you're interested more generally, so Journal of Human Rights and the Environment forthcoming, and also this this book, Climate Litigation, Global Perspectives, which has various perspectives from the Global South and Global North that, if you're interested in the topic, is a really good place to start. I'll end by just a short ad, which is for a Human Rights Center event next week on litigation and climate change. And we have 3 really great speakers. So if you're interested in this topic or interested in what I've said, please do attend that talk. It has some great speakers that are coming along. Thanks a lot.
Varsha, thank you. Thank you so much for your presentation. We have a little bit of time, 5 minutes or so for questions and for exchanges from the audience. So I'm going to invite the audience and participants again to raise any questions through the Q&A if they want and are able to. I'm going to kick the Q&A off really by taking a prerogative, the chair's prerogative, and as my dog enters the scene on the High Scout. Stage left, as it were. So I'm going to ask you each really to address a question that certainly for me, given my ideological and intellectual prejudices and commitments, seems to be a burning issue, which is whether green capitalism makes any sense whatsoever, or whether it is genuinely achievable. What seems to be largely absent from many of these discussions at COP and at previous COPs is really, you know, the clear incompatibilities and contradictions between the logic of capitalism in its various forms and imposing constraints and restraints upon our destruction of the environment. So I don't know who wants to address that question first. I think, Stephen, maybe your presentation kind of dealt with it more directly, but very keen to hear other contributions too.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. Yeah, thanks very much, Andrew. I think that's a great question as well too. Green capitalism, and I have to say that I believe in that concept, and for me it's very much something which I think has to happen if by what we think of as green capitalism is actually taking the existing structures that there are internationally and ensuring that in all areas of the economy and law internationally, the way that business and trade works, it's constrained by the requirement that it does so in a manner which is consistent with the planetary boundaries which there are in terms of the climate, in terms of the environment generally. But I would also add to that, you know, people's human rights as well, which also get left behind. And I would just comment that if we look at the international legal structures, so for example, with company law, you trace it back to the early 1800s. It was designed before we had these concerns, and yet the basic structures are there, and they haven't changed that much in 200 years. If you look at international trade law, really started to develop in the modern sense just after the Second World War. You know, after the Second World War, they developed a system which is still more or less the same now, and it hasn't taken into account properly, in my opinion, the pressures that are placed on the environment, climate, and people's human rights as well. So those are just 2 examples where I would say the international community really needs to address properly some of these ways that business and trade operates and integrate the modern day concerns into them.
Thank you, Stephen. Lisa, very keen to hear if you have a view on green capitalism?
I don't think I have a specific answer to the question, but maybe just some reflections through the arts. And I guess the question of the relative success or failure is also one about the fact that what is really needed for any change is a significant change in mindset, the rethinking the very way in which humans position, we position ourselves within the environment rather than against nature. And I think what's interesting for me to witness through my field of research is the way in which artists are very much challenging the preconceptions or the structuring of those relationships of exploitation and extraction and of profit, and really enabling us to think kind of in a long view as well about what are the sorts of expectations that the project of modernity and industrial modernity generate for how we anticipate living on this planet, which are much bigger and more philosophical questions, but ones that also needed to be embedded within these sorts of discussions, I think. And there is a significant sort of shift towards processes of recuperation, of reconsidering animistic ideas about the environment, and unlearning some of the really entrenched, naturalized ideas that we have that have commodified nature and closed it and considered it as just a form of potential profit. And so I think that there's significant work being done that isn't necessarily giving an answer to this question, but is certainly giving, fertilizing the terrain for us to be able to think differently about how we can be together on a planet and coexist in much more sustainable ways. So yeah, I think that would be my perspective on it.
Thank you, Lisa. If Bersha will allow me, I'm going to go straight to a question that we do have in the Q&A, because as I say, we have just a couple minutes left. This is from an anonymous attendee. I'm interested to know the views of Lisa and Bersha on whether COP26 will work or not. I'm also interested in both the views of Bersha and Stephen on how effective the litigation is likely to be. Are there signs of government compliance with decisions? So Stephen's title was why COP26 won't work. This question is for Lisa and Bersha to reflect upon Stephen's position, I take it. Bersha, did you want to kick us off?
Sure, I'll try and answer that and the litigation part, and also maybe tie in green capitalism. So will COP26 work? I mean, it kind of, not to cop out of the question, but what do we mean by work? What are our expectations for it to work? And that's the kind of context that we have to, I mean, there's, I think there is a lot of, essentially there is a lot of, it's not so black and white, because there are a lot of countries and then a lot of campaigners doing some good work to try and ramp up ambition and so on, and ensure that there's better systems within the system that is flawed, as Stephen laid out, to try and make it work. And it's taken a lot of work to get to Paris, where the Paris Agreement, a lot of work to get that trust between countries and so on. Where I think it's problematic is where you have lots of different pledges, and this is where the green capitalism bit comes in, and greenwashing and so on, where, for example, even for this current obsession with net zero is highly problematic, because a lot of the models for net zero targets are based on technologies that have not even been tested or robustly tested. So I'm saying that I will do this based on some technologies which will be created in the future at certain points and things like that. So there's that. Then there's this whole business of offsetting. So I will continue to emit, but I will start to count tree plantations in other countries as my offset, for example. So this is where there's a lot of greenwashing around what pledges are being made and so on. And hence we will say that, it won't work because of the fact we'll think that these pledges people may actually be genuine when they're saying these pledges and so on. So it's, that's kind of not to say one way or the other that it will work or it won't work, but it will progress. I think there's progress being made, but it's far too slow compared to the scale of the crisis. Yeah.
Thank you, Bersa. Lisa, are you optimistic, pessimistic about the prospects for COP26?
I mean, I think I agree with Bersha that it's not this case of a black and white answer of whether it will fail or will succeed, but the way in which the impacts and aftershocks of an event like this play out is much more protracted. And I think one thing that was significant is the mainstreaming, I guess, of these concerns now. You know, we saw David Attenborough appear as a guest speaker at the beginning, and whatever our opinions of his particular framings of these questions and the imaginaries that come with it, it certainly speaks to the fact that this is lodged in a much bigger and more broadly collective mindset than perhaps, you know, in previous iterations of COP. And I think that that in itself at least shows some cause for optimism about the necessary shift in mindset which are there, and the kind of collective momentum behind something like this, which is not just about the event as it happens, but about what can feed out from it, and how it provides greater visibility for the ongoing work of different, you know, activists, indigenous groups who are constantly doing this work, not within the kind of very constrained framework of the kind of spectacle of the summit itself, but very much on an ongoing, much less visible way. So I think there's reason to be at least a bit optimistic, but I definitely reserve a conclusion on that speaks directly perhaps to the question as it was posed.
Thank you, Lisa. Finally, Stephen, reflecting on Bersha's focus upon litigation, are you hopeful that litigation is a way forward for activism in particular? Is often a contrast is drawn between the sort of dry clinical work of lawyers and then the activists out in the streets, as it were. It's so fascinating to see the two being brought together in effective ways. Did you have any final reflections on that process?
Yes, I think it's a natural and an important component in terms of activism, and also pressure on governments and raising awareness. It has a number of important factors to it, and also just changing policy. But if we think about the crisis that's being faced, really there needs to be activity and action on a whole range of fronts, and this is what we see in terms of engineering, architecture, technology, you know, development of science, government thinking, and so forth. So it's one important part in a whole range of activities which need to move forward together, in my opinion, to bring the change that's necessary. The one danger, I think, with climate litigation, or a lot of the climate litigation which has happened to date, is that, again, it does focus on governments. And whilst there is this focus on governments and we are not looking at the international economic frameworks, then I think there's a danger that we're not addressing the root causes of the problem. And I would like to see more attention on that, but it is a very important component in what environmental lawyers can do and achieve.
Stephen, thank you. And as Bersha advertised, and my colleague Katia has placed in the chat, we're returning to specifically the role of litigation in tackling climate change in next week's HRC speaker series. So looking forward to that. So look, I've run over by 4 minutes, I believe. So I'll be very brief. Thank you so much to our panelists. I think your work has just showcased once again the remarkable interdisciplinarity of work that is occurring across the Human Rights Centre and the Centre for Environment and Society, which are the two groups who have organised this particular event. Thank you to the audience for bearing with us to this point and for raising your questions. We're going to take a 5-minute comfort or refresh break, and please don't go away, or don't go too far at least, and come back to us at what would that be, at 20 minutes to 3 o'clock our time. And then my colleague Kellam Jayasingh will chair the second panel, and looking forward to seeing you all again. Again, thank you, Lisa, thank you, Bersha, and thank you, Stephen. Thank you. See you soon.
As you were, listening, the first panel discussed about researching climate change, and particularly they focus on interdisciplinary perspectives. And the speakers excellent way. They discuss about what the directions that the researchers should take, and then on this our challenging task of handling the climate and ecological emergency and this global crisis. And so then at the end of their presentations, they nicely connected their work with the activism and activities. So how we promote this activism across the globe and the challenges that they are facing. So our speakers in the second panel now, they are specifically focusing on this, how we respond to climate and ecological emergency through activism and teaching. So it's very relevant to our education institutions, and especially Essex, that our sort of curriculum and our the programs that we are delivering as an institution. And so in this session, there are 4 excellent speakers that I just briefly mentioned their background. So Dr. Jane Hindley, she's a lecturer at the School of Philosophy and Arts History, and she will talk about sustainability practice and activism. And she is one of our active members at the Center for Environment and Society. And then second speaker is Professor Susan Oliver. So she is from School of Literature, Film and Theatre Studies. And also she will talk about the environment in the arts and humanities curriculum, challenging human and non-human boundaries. Very interesting presentation. And then the third speaker is Dr. Thomas Cameron. He's a senior lecturer at School of Life Sciences. And he will talk about is applied science activism or not, questioning that, and a case study in the designation of the Essex Marine Conservation Zone. And then finally, the fourth speaker, Ms. Daisy Malt. She's our University of Essex Sustainability Manager, sustainability in the area of environment and recycling. She's our manager for that. And she will talk about tackling the climate and ecological emergency, the university's response, the University of Essex response in particular. So these 4 speakers will talk 10 minutes each. So we will collect the questions and Q&A section, and then we will respond to your questions at the end of these 4 presentations. Thank you very much. So I invite the first speaker, Dr. Jane, to start talking about sustainability practice and activism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keelan. Actually, when I was, just share my screen. Okay, thanks very much, Keelan, and thanks very much to Jude, Katia and Shamida for organising this event today. Jude actually asked me to talk about my experiences of activism, and so I thought this would be it was actually quite a challenge. I'm not used to talking about my own experiences, but I thought it'd be useful in the context of COP26 to think about, how we can become, what are the different pathways to becoming activists. And we've already heard about different pathways or different types of activism. So through litigation, grassroots political activism, and so on. And I really wanted to focus on, how I came to be an activist, in some ways quite reluctantly, I would say. But also, what are the it's very easy in the context of these big UN conferences to have either low expectations or high expectations that are then disappointed. But how we keep going over time, and what are the kind of antidotes to despair that we can draw on. And I would, the challenge ahead is absolutely massive, because our whole civilization has been built on fossil fuels. It's been built on neoliberal, unregulated economy and society, competitiveness, individualism, at a time when we need regulation, collaboration, and compassion, actually. But I think this is a challenge that we all have to get involved in, or within our different constraints and possibilities. And before sort of talking about some of the things that have sustained me or inspired me over the last 10, 12 years, I really want to emphasize that there's many forms of activism, and we've already heard some of them. And also people have very different paths into activism and into different types of activities. Okay, for me, I think one of the real epiphany around climate change, it was something that, you know, I'm getting quite old now, that had been talked about in the 1990s and through the early 2000s, but it was always, for me, it was something like in the background. It was only really when I went to a guest seminar by this guy, Kevin Anderson, who's Professor of Energy and Climate Change, and he was at that time advisor to New Labour, and really was one of the key people who had a lot of input into the Climate Change Act, together with other people at the Tyndall Centre. And it was actually, this was a very long seminar, it was about 2 hours. He kept showing us these graphs of trajectories. And it was like, for me, it was just a complete epiphany. It was like, oh my God, this is what climate change is. And I think because there's been a lot of misinformation in the media, actually having that kind of hard-hitting event from somebody who really knows their subject, and Kevin Anderson is actually very good at talking to a broad range of publics, is really important. And what he was saying basically has been backed up by subsequent IPCC reports. Current trends are taking us to 4 degrees. This would be catastrophic and irreversible. Staying below 1.5 degrees will require rapid, far-reaching, unprecedented changes in all aspects of society and economy. And I think he was also kind of a role model, because at this time he was just like going around talking, giving talks to everybody, you know, different publics, different, from community halls to the, you know, the House of Parliament and so on. I was quite fortunate at this time, because this was actually quite a positive moment in the UK. New Labour was actually acting on scientific advice. They'd suddenly woken up in 2005 with the Stern report. They were engaging with the sustainability movement, who had been actually experimenting with sustainable agriculture, housing, building, and so on for years. And it looked like something was exciting, was happening. Unfortunately, and including, I should just say, the Climate Change Act, which for its time was a very advanced piece of legislation and still has kept very reactionary conservative governments to account, or constrain them. But this next decade, I think, has been a very hard decade for anyone concerned about the environment in the UK, because we really had 10 years of denial with this fossil fuel corporate backlash led, or the spokesman was Nigel Lawson, a reversal of these new initiatives that had come into being, and an alliance with the fossil fuel industry. Okay, so what are the sources of hope that you can keep you going in these times? Because we will have other times when progress is not fast enough, we may feel disillusioned, despair. I think one of the key things that really came out during this period was the unlikely alliances, grassroots direct action against fossil fuel projects, what Naomi Klein calls blockadia. And it became very clear that we cannot, and this partly addresses Andrew's question, we cannot have neoliberal, green neoliberalism, because the contradiction between free markets and the orthodoxy of no regulation will not work if we want to move to a green, sustainable society. And actually, I mean, one of Naomi Klein's argument in her 2014 book is activists have to keep going. You have to keep going anyway, that things will get better. But we need a new political economic model. And that this can be an opportunity. We need a just transition that addresses neoliberal injustices. We've seen the incredible polarization of wealth and power in the last 30 years, and at the same time addresses the climate. I think for me, because I had studied social movements, that was really my area of expertise as a political sociologist with an interdisciplinary background. The role of social movements in regime transitions is very important. And we've seen this in the role of the labor movement, a long period of time, thinking about different political configurations, how the economy could be reorganized, which led to the post-war social democratic welfare state. Even the neoliberal revolution was based on this kind of thinking about, and think tanks and so on. It was a social movement from the 40s. So neoliberalism is not our destiny. There are there will be historic changes and so on. I also witnessed the transitions from authoritarian rule in Europe, Latin America, South Africa, Taiwan. So social movements really have an important role. And at times of, in very challenging times when prospects don't look good, it's very important to hang on to that. And I think my orientation to local activism has also been shaped by my PhD, which documented a successful movement to stop a big dam. And this was really based on the mobilization of Indigenous rights linked into new global norms and patient grassroots organizing. And I observed the leaders of the movement, their tireless action, their tireless explanations. Okay, so I've really been, I suppose, an education for sustainability activist, and that includes a kind of broader giving local public talks and so on. And really the catalyst for this were the denialism, the lack of information for engaging the public between 2010 and 2019, 2020, and also my students. So in the Interdisciplinary Studies Centre, my students were very concerned about social justice, but had almost no concern about the environment, which suggested massive gap in the primary, secondary curriculum, and it really showed the need for education for sustainability initiatives and new integration of the environmental themes into the curriculum. Sources of inspiration for me, I was taught by second wave feminists who had been saying, where are the women? Where are the women? So in these education institutions, whether it's schools or in the university, where is the environment? Where is it in the curriculum? Where is the signage? Where is the educational process? And then the work of Paulo Freire, who's a Latin American activist who led and really was an educationalist who spearheaded literacy campaigns to transform the position of the poor under authoritarian rule. Okay, so both had consciousness raising and mobilization of citizens at the core of these two pedagogies. Okay, I don't know how much time I've got left. But these are,
I think almost.
Yes, some of the experiments I've carried out in the university. I'm currently doing a project with schools, primary schools, to try and embed and provide catalysts for embedding environmental education in primary schools. And that's with colleagues from CES and Colchester Borough Council. But I think, one of the things that's happened recently is we've seen different types of activism really shifting public debate. So 2018 was a key year with the Extinction Rebellion strikes. Climate emergency declarations enabled students and staff at the university to draw up a petition, and we've had a very positive response to that in the VC's declaration, support for climate emergency declaration. And it's really this came from a student who approached several of us to support a petition at the university. And I just wanted to finish with just a few lessons and consolations that I've had. And I think one thing is, because we are facing a major cultural shift, we have to have a major cultural shift, then acting locally and filling out, whether it's at your local, in local organizations, changing local cultures is also important, as well as attending demonstrations and so on. Often you can capitalize on broader conjunctures, and often you'll find you're pushing at open doors. Activism also involves a lot of patience, persistence, and perseverance, and sometimes being thick-skinned. But you know, it's really also has many consolations. First of all, that we'd be in a much worse position without activism, and also that sustainability initiatives are fun and you'll meet great people. So, and Tom will be talking about some of his experience, which is sort of in the local community, which are, you know, another fascinating sort of activism, I think. Okay, that's everything. Kilam, are you?
Yeah, thank you. And can you stop the sharing, Jane?
Oh,
yeah. Thank you, Jane. And it's laid down a foundation in excellent way to other speakers and continue this activism discussions. I remember I have to mention here, Jane is well known for her active involvement in the sustainability. She is one of these colleagues who started this sustainability programs for undergraduates, especially interdisciplinary program for undergraduates. She has run her own like several years. I appreciate your contribution to activism within the university community. Thank you, Jane. And the second speaker is Professor Susan Oliver. Susan, are you there?
I'm here, Kellen.
Yeah,
I can't
please.
start my video because somebody's blocking it.
Okay, I mean, I have Katya, can you find out it?
It says the host has stopped it.
Okay, I'll check that. Meantime, you can start, so I can.
Yeah, but I need to put a presentation up, and I will do that. Can you just tell me if you can see the screen?
Yes.
Can you see my presentation?
Yeah. Now you can see. Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah.
I can move ahead with that. Thank you,
Thanks,
Callum.
yeah.
And
Yeah,
I'd like to really thank Jane and Jude for inviting me to speak today and for organising this, this really important conference. So very glad to be here. Most people so far have talked about the contemporary. I'm actually a scholar of the 18th and 19th centuries. I want to talk about the importance of historical ecologies. One of the most important influences on my work on environmentalism in recent years stemmed out of a meeting in a lift at a conference in Chicago with Rob Nixon, whose book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor, confronts the way that contemporary society moves so fast that it cannot see things that are ultimately extremely violent, that pan out and evolve over time, the effects of which don't appear often until they are unstoppable and in a much later period. And that obviously is where we are with climate change. I just wanted to say that to kind of introduce my talk. I'm going to get on with the talk now. And I'll begin by setting a scene which isn't today, but without which we wouldn't be where we are now in terms of the climate, species loss, and related issues of environmental justice. I'll use my 10 minutes to talk about how historical writing, paired with interdisciplinary 21st century eco-criticism, engages students in a long trajectory of critical inquiry. Now, that trajectory shows how the critique of the legitimacy and the arbitrariness of boundaries between human and non-human species, equally affected by climate change and the environmental catastrophe, along with the concept of rights, is neither new nor without precedent. And these boundaries are clearly vehicles for exercising political and legal power, but they onwardly affect networks of life systems way beyond the human. The existence of those boundaries between human and non-human life forms depends on communication through forms of language and through conventions of perception, how we see things. Now, as a specialist in the 18th and 19th century who involved students in research from day one, much of my teaching is concerned with what we can learn from historical ecologies. My recent book, my most recent book, you can see the cover image here on screen at the moment, Walter Scott and the Greening of Scotland, Emergent Ecologies of a Nation, explores poetry, fiction and other prose writing that was published between 1795 and 1832. Now let's just think about those dates. This was the time of the Romantic movement in literature and culture and the arts. It was also the period, the very period, in which the carbon Anthropocene began and was moving into the overdrive that has led us into the situation that we're in now. The same period was also that of the Scottish Enlightenment social inquiry and of the agricultural revolution. I'm going to bring those features together. Now, I've taught many other writers from a critical perspective of the arbitrariness of animal, plant, and human boundaries in environmental history. But I'm going to use Scott and my recent book as an example today for reasons of concision and for reasons that I hope will become clear. Born in 1771, Scott grew up in Edinburgh in the very years when James Watt was making efficiency improvements to the steam engine that would introduce the age of carbon consumption. The same decade saw the landscape of rural Scotland radically changed to accommodate a shift to what was essentially not just sheep farming, but industrial scale sheep farming. Lime fertilizer was used ubiquitously to promote grass growth, altering the pH of soils and affecting everything that lived or grew in them. Rural populations were displaced forcibly or through a strategy of economic deprivation. Imported Swedish grass varieties were replacing natural species and mixed herbage in pasture, and the diversity in wildflowers was being reduced at an unprecedented rate. In a traditional ballad passed on to Scott by a shepherd's wife and then included in his work, the title of the ballad is The Flowers of the Forest, the disappearance of real wildflowers in the 1800s is analogized with a historical term used for the young men who had died 3 centuries earlier in the Battle of Flodden Field. Now, continuing with the subject of plants, people and warfare, an episode of extreme violence against trees in Scott's first novel, Waverley, draws attention to the collapse of perceptual boundaries between the human and the non-human that often follows situations of war or civil insurgency and unrest that lead to human and environmental rights abuses. In a chapter titled Desolation, 2 immense horse chestnut trees are, quote, ravaged and blown apart, quote, with malevolent ingenuity by soldiers who place gunpowder charges in their cavities. The trees, one of which remains alive after about 1/4 of the trunk was torn from its mass, resemble maimed bodies. Their ravishment, and that word is used, prior to their mutilation, and the manner of their destruction suggests sexual violence as a weapon of war and intimidation. Now, Scott's description of these trees' desecration does not pull any punctures. You have it on screen at the moment. In one compartment of this old-fashioned garden were 2 immense horse chestnut trees. The spoilers, that's the soldiers, with malevolent ingenuity had mined them and placed a quantity of gunpowder in the cavity. One had been shivered to pieces by the explosion, and the wreck lay scattered around, encumbering the ground it had so long shadowed. The other mine had been more partial in its effect. About 1/4 of the trunk of the tree was torn from the mass, which, mutilated and defaced on the one side, still spread on the other its ample and undiminished boughs. The destruction of these trees serves a number of purposes. At one level, it analogizes the violence that ended the Jacobite rebellion with the massacre by the British Army of largely unarmed defeated opponents at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. It also foreshadows the torture and politically motivated execution by hanging, drawing and quartering of a Highland chieftain and his lieutenant at the end of Waverley. Thirdly, the tree, and importantly for this paper and our conference, the trees are treated in this way because they are perceived as being of no economic value. Horse chestnuts do not produce food, and their soft textured wood is not durable enough to be commercially useful except in decorative marquetry and carving. In other words, they are of little value other than as ornamentation in a future capitalist economy where decoration without utility or revenue is worthless. Moreover, interpreted environmentally, the incident represents an act of ecocide that derived from an actual historical event in Invergarry Castle, where the house, its associated buildings and 2 horse chestnut trees were burnt by Hanoverian soldiers on the instructions of the Duke of Cumberland, a son of George II, who became known as Butcher Cumberland because of his ruthless violent conduct at and after Culloden. Now, Scott's interest in borders and boundaries comes to the foreground best in his writing about such periods of major historical change. A repeated motif in that fiction is the closeness between persecuted groups of people and animal species, particularly when the main motive is to clear an area of unwanted occupants. A Legend of the Wars of Montrose, set in 1644, and I'm just going to start my video because it's just come back. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Yeah, A Legend of the War of Montrose features an outlaw clan who are known as the Children of the Mist. They live in old growth forest on the borders between Perthshire and Argyll, endangered forest. Scott notes in a footnote in the novel that this area of forest was already endangered in his own time. Now, they're known as the Children of the Mist because of their ability to disappear into impenetrable bog pine woodland, a dense wetland habitat that still exists in very small remnants and is critically endangered in Scotland today. And I was fortunate to visit some of this area in a short holiday that I had in September. I got some wonderful photos. They're not included in this presentation, alas. But in the setting of this novel, the Children of the Mist, who are competing with wild animals for survival in a very difficult environment, are described as having the legal status of wolves. That meant that they could be shot or otherwise killed on sight. In the story, Son of the Mist Ranulph MacE, whose name actually means son of an eagle, protests to the people who have captured him and are about to execute him that he is, quote, a man. I'm going to move on to the next slide. Why is this not moving? Here we are, okay. Do you call yourself a man, said the interrogator, who have done the deeds of a wolf? I do, answered the outlaw. I am a man, like my forefathers. While wrapped in the mantle of peace, we were lambs. It was rent from us, and ye now call us wolves. Give us the huts ye have burned, our children whom ye have murdered, our widows whom ye have starved. Now, this is historical fiction, but I'm sure this will resonate for many people who are working on displaced communities in the world in which we live now, with the kinds of environmental crisis and the conflict with capitalism that we're seeing. The zoomorphic analogy here refers to circumstances in which the Children of the Mist had been accused of a pretty horrific murder. And in that murder, a victim's head was put on a dining table and bread and cheese placed in its mouth as if it was a suckling pig. Now, this ritual of human revenge, and that's what it is, there's no comparison with the behavior of wolves, and that hardly needs saying. Wolves don't do that kind of thing, nor is it bestial behavior, because this is not the behavior of animals. It is the behavior of human beings in cycles of revolution, in cycles of revenge. Ranulph MacE internalizes his status to later claim that he is not just a wolf, but also a raven. And he likens himself also to a tree whose branches have been lopped from his trunk and that awaits its roots being torn from the soil. Where have we come across that analogy before? He compares his people with eagles and foxes, both of whom were hunted by gamekeepers almost to extinction, and to extinction if they could have done it, during Scott's own lifetime. Now, it's impossible to know exactly where the last wolf in Scotland lived and died, but huge expanses of the old forest in Argyll and Perthshire were burnt during the reign of Mary, Queen of Scots in the later 16th century in an attempt to destroy those animals' natural habitat. The persecution was a response to attacks by wolves on livestock and people, but countless other animals and birds died along with them in the deforestation, and we know what the onward effects of deforestation have been for our own time. And I'm just going to flash up on screen now a stone which is known as the Wolf Stone. It is said to commemorate in the area of forest where the Children of the Mist lived, that is said to commemorate where the last wolf in Scotland died. I want to move on to a third and final example, which comes from another of Scott's novels, The Bride of Lammermoor. I teach this at second year undergraduate level in conjunction with Gaetano Donizetti's operatic interpretation. A young landowner in the Scottish borders is compelled for political reasons to live in a half derelict, and it's more than half derelict, it hardly exists at all, castle named Wolf's Crag on the edge of a crumbling cliff, below which is the quicksand in which he will die. A romantic hero, Edgar Ravenswood, enters the novel by saving the heroine from attack by a wild bull. Now let's just think about this. The bull and Edgar both live in a time and on land where they are able only to subsist rather than to flourish. But while the animal is an instance of dangerous but desirable wildness in a picturesque landscape, charismatic megafauna, if you like, the kind of thing we like to see, but we know might actually be dangerous, we keep our distance. Edgar is an unwelcome and intolerable presence whose home equates with his status. And I introduce here Baston Gachalard's work on the poetics of space, with students to think about what the analogy of the home actually means. Edgar's appearance at the end of the novel with his, quote, matted and dishevelled locks of hair which escaped from under his hat reveals him to be much more primitive than he has appeared until that point. The cloak he has repeatedly wrapped about his body throughout the novel, and which has hidden his emaciated physical condition, is displaced from one shoulder. His features, quote, wasted and ghastly, anticipate his imminent death. It is as if he has travelled backwards in evolutionary time, reducing the perceived divergence between human beings and animal species. His matted hair analogizes the earlier description of the shaggy mane seen in the wild bull. The Bride brings into focus the concept of an endangered species and of cultural erasure. The role given to estate management in enabling the survival or extinction of each is remarkable. And it's something that students are asked to think about in terms of, and this is where the module becomes very interdisciplinary, Plantationocene 21st century eco-theory, which includes human rights and environmental justice. And I bring in at that point Donna Haraway's work on animal criticism, and Ursula Heisser's work on a sense of place and extinction. Now, I've used these examples in this short talk just to explain something of how historical fiction can help students to think about environmental justice and human rights failures from the past, in order that they might be better able to confront similar situations in our own time. It's not long, after all, since migrants crossed the border from Mexico into the United States and were openly described by a major political leader as vermin and insects. And that situation is one which is frighteningly repetitive around the world. I'll be happy to take any questions that people might ask about the kind of teaching that I do, or the relevance of historical ecologies to where we are today. But for now, because I know that we need to move on to another speaker, thank you for listening, and I pass to Tom Cameron.
Thank you, Suzanne, and this excellent presentation about historical ecology and demonstration how we can learn from the history. That we usually look at contemporary issues and debate among ourselves, but this is an excellent guide that how we can look at the history, and we learn always from the history. So it's a reminder to us. Tom, I invite you for your speech now.
Thank you very much, Calum. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent. So, yes, I was asked to speak about activism in the context of the work that I do, specifically the research that I do, which is mostly in ecology and coastal and aquatic sciences. And I've got to admit, I was a bit worried about it. What's this word, activism? I had to start examining whether am I an activist? I had to examine my identity. I also had to examine my biases, and I'm going to deal with them first by looking at what activism is, or at least what my biases are, and why they're actually important to me in the context of the research that I do. I don't necessarily want the label activist for the research I do. At least that's what I think, a priori, before looking and studying through it and questioning it in preparation for this talk. And I'll talk you through that journey and get to the conclusion that I came to in preparing for this talk. And in that, I'm not going to speak specifically about climate activism, which has actually gained a really good reputation and actually a lot of admonishment in recent years because of the success that it's had and the justice that it's had and the righteous justice that it's had. But activism in the broader sense that I come across in the topics and in the research works that I do, which tends to be about the environment more generally and biodiversity and how humans interact with that biodiversity. So what is activism? You know, if I said, are you an activist? Jane talked about this, and she talked about specifically some of the things I've picked up on here. A definition of it could be policy or action, often thought about as physical actions to do vigorous campaigning, not just campaigning, vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change. You may identify some of these activist moments on screen. You may identify with some of them more or less. Jane, you may have even been on one or two of these. We can see Insulate Britain stopping people getting to work in the aid of climate. We can see animal rights protesters stopping people getting to work to create a vaccine, which is right, which is wrong. We can see a march protesting against business as usual in the management of our countryside. We can see another march protesting for business as usual in the management of our countryside. We can see a very successful campaign and activism known as Fish Fight to campaign against discards of fishes in the management of fishes linked to the marine environment and fishing. And we can see another campaign recently run by Greenpeace to protest against fishing on the seabed with super trawlers, where they did the illegal dropping of stones into British waters to stop trawlers going there. Is activism right? That is the problem I always come across, me personally. If you like, my biases take me to that question. You know, is Extinction Rebellion right to protest against the management of the countryside using certain pesticides because it leads to insect declines, when the message isn't that simple? Actually, there are many insect species, in fact, you know, a good number of them that are on the increase. Some are declining, some are on the increase. It's a complex picture. What about Hugh's fish fight? Heart was in the right place and certainly resulted in massive social change and political change. We got the discard ban very quickly, I might add. But what were the consequences of that for the policy relating to fishing? Actually, there were lots of unintended consequences. Fishing total allowable catches have had to go up to allow it to operate. So there are now more fish dying because of it than before. And what about the species over the last 200-300 years that have evolved to become dependent on fisheries discards? They are now declining, and some of them are quite rare species. Surely this next one must be the easy one. What about the campaign to ban trophy hunting? You know, the Western world telling mainly Africa to stop managing the wildlife the way it manages it successfully, largely, all kind of spurred on by this wonderful picture. You couldn't ask for a better picture against trophy hunting. You know, the great white savior with the extra white teeth of the dentist that went to Africa to hunt Cecil the lion. And yet actually this is the easiest one. You know, conservation isn't about protecting an individual lion or, controversially, an individual horse chestnut tree. It's about protecting the forest or protecting the lion's extinction risk as a population. And celebrity intervention is causing problems for conservation science. So is activism right? Not always, and that is my struggle with it, because it is simplified. It has to be that good message, that easy message to get people involved. It's often right as well, but not always. And that's because for every complex problem, and in the natural world, complexity rules. There are always complex, tricky problems. There is always a solution that is simple, but it's usually wrong. But complexity is welcome in decision making. Science is used in policy making. In fact, we constantly hear, because of the context of the COVID pandemic, that science is at the heart of government decision making, but it is only one part of that. There are lots of other issues that come into play, public opinion being a really important one. So let's speak a little bit through the context of the work that I actually do and why activism, is maybe not the right label for the work that I do as an applied scientist. And I work on a number of marine conservation issues in the coasts of Essex in the UK. And one of them is reversing the decline of European oysters, a native species that is very important locally. It's important locally mainly due to the history and identity it has with Colchester and the cultural significance that it has. And it, over many decades, hundreds of years even, has brought lots of employment and wealth locally. It used to be much more widely distributed. It's declined by about 85% across its former range. It used to be found in lots of offshore populations, and they're almost exclusively extinct. And where it's now found tends to be where there's actually a utility or interest in inshore waters. So it's then said if this native oyster used to be so abundant, it's maybe the missing link. It's the one feature, the one habitat that could be missing from most European protected areas. And so my research seeks to underpin finding the information that says, where was this species and what abundance was it in the past? What was the baselines and how can we help bring it back? Can it support fisheries and can it support biodiversity? And I don't do this on my own. I do it with a range of people, both here at the school, from PhD students, postdocs, and other colleagues that you'll recognize, and other local stakeholders and government agencies. So how did it start? Well, it started in about 2010, where this person, Sarah Allison, now Dr. Sarah Allison, did completed her PhD at Essex, got contacted by local oystermen who said, we've got lots of oysters here. We know they're here. We know they're precious, but we're worried because they're not protected. And if we don't fish them, someone else will, and then they're gone. So she worked with them to try and document what oysters were there and where they were. And she teamed up with the university to do that. And she went out and did a piece of very basic applied science where she worked out where the oysters were and how many there were. And click your fingers and all of a sudden, we've got a marine conservation zone that protects this species and the habitats that it creates. Notice that happened in 2013 and the work's only published in 2020. The paper is secondary to the impact. It doesn't work like that. What actually happened is that all that data went into a report, a big report that was published by the Essex Wildlife Trust. And that report was submitted to government because a consultation was expected. A planned consultation was expected, called the Marine Conservation Zones Consultation on Proposals for Designation. And from that, we got our Marine Conservation Zone. So there wasn't so much activism as a planned process of submitting evidence to government to say that this is the right place to put a conservation zone. And this is why you should do it, to protect this little brown, relatively unknown invertebrate off the Essex coast. So then you've got this protected site, but what are we going to do to look after it? The agency that I met in a train station in 2014, just by random chance, IFCA, that are actually supposed to look after this marine conservation zone, were given a job immediately as soon as that designation happened, but they didn't know how to do that job. They didn't know what makes oysters tick. What is their ecology? Can they ever support fisheries sustainably? Do they support biodiversity? So we step in with them to do the science to try and find the answers to those questions. We're not doing it out of activism, and I'm not going to go through the results today. Yes, we studied them. We did lots of surveys. We did lots of cool experiments. We found lots of animals. We got loads of data on distributions and densities. We answered the question about whether they can be harvested and when they will recover. We found out they do support, oysters do support other biodiversity. They are a great species to have in your seas. But that isn't what makes things happen. That's the science in the background. That's how you judge me here at the University of Essex. But the community and society don't judge me that way. They judge me whether I turn up to workshops. They judge me whether I participate and engage with them to help create policy that works based on the expertise that I gain from the research we do. The oystermen in the top right judge me about whether I turn up to back them up when they need help. And the IFCA officers in the bottom right judge me about whether I'll come to the office to help them interpret some tricky science or help them develop some proposals that can be proposed to the oystermen so that they'll get on board. All of that comes together, the science, the engagement, the participation into responding to consultations to support the development of policy that allows the management of the marine conservation zone. So is applied science activism? Not in my opinion. No, it's not activism. And actually, it would be dangerous for me to be thought of as an activist because I need to be an advocate for that evidence to everyone, not just the oystermen and not just the conservation NGO and not just the statutory agency, but all of them. I need to be the honest broker in the middle. I need to be available to them all to make good policy work. So advocacy is not quite as vigorous as activism. It's still public and outspoken and transparent support for something and recommending it when it is evidence-based. So I'm happy with the label that I'm an advocate. I can write to my MP. We can all write to our MP and respond to consultations and get your evidence onto the books of statutory agencies by not just relying on your papers, but write them a letter about your papers. That is what works for them. They won't go and look for your paper. Thank you very much. I hope that answers the question. Is applied science activism or not? I say not. Gilliam, you're on mute.
Sorry, yeah. Thanks, Tom. It's a really stimulating presentation that make us think about advocacy and activism, and then what actually, I mean, the ways that we are reconstructing this conversation about our discussion about climate change and ecological emergency, how we respond to that. So we all are in the same boat in terms of our approaches and the efforts, whether we name ourselves as activists or advocates of these reforms and initiatives. Thank you. And it's a brilliant impact case I have seen with your presentation. Thanks for sharing that. The last presentation in this panel is Daisy Wont. So Daisy will talk about the University of Essex initiatives in the climate emergency. Daisy is yours.
Hello, thank you. I'm very conscious of time, so I will try and keep this short and sweet. I've just got a hopefully brief presentation just to kind of give some context. Get back to the start. So I have kind of added the title of Swallowing the Alarm Clock to this. So it's tackling the climate and ecological emergency at the university. Swallowing the alarm clock is something I've heard Cristiana Figueres say. She's the former executive secretary to the UNFCCC, who is credited with being quite pivotal in getting the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, based on discussions in the previous panel session. Make of that what you will. But this idea is around all of us kind of internalizing the challenges that we face, and recognizing that we all kind of need to make it our problem. So at Essex, sustainability and kind of carbon reduction has been part of our work for around a decade. I've been at the university for about 5 years, and the speed with which momentum has gathered, particularly in the last 3 years, and certainly the last 18 months, I have never been asked to speak at so many different, staff conferences and team meetings and, big sessions. So you can tell that people are really starting to make real strides in this. As Jane mentioned a little earlier, there was a petition at the beginning of 2020 that went to the Vice-Chancellor's office calling on the university to declare a climate emergency. From that, it was decided a climate emergency group would be set up. So that is formed by representatives from across the university, so from research and education, professional services, making sure that we're all kind of contributing to this. That has now evolved into the Climate and Ecological Emergency Advisory Group to kind of better reflect the purpose of the group. So it's around discussing some of the bigger and potentially contentious issues that we take, and making sure that we're doing things in the right way. A big part of our work so far has been around working out when to declare that we'll be net zero, and how. So we've had consultants who've carried out a big survey of our emissions, scope 1 and 2, so that's from our energy usage in our fleet vehicles, to establish a realistic date. We've gone with 2035 because we've kind of set ourselves a challenge, but gone with something that's realistic. So the net zero for scope 1 and 2 basically focuses on a 76% reduction compared with our 2019 emissions, with a maximum of 3,000 tonnes of carbon offsetting, but obviously the focus is on reduction overall. Then finally, scope 3 looks at the kind of emissions in our supply chain, and we're doing a lot of work around that at the moment to understand what those emissions are and at what point we can reduce those down. They're essentially the emissions of everybody else who we buy from and work with, and how people travel. So it's much broader than kind of everything that's directly within our responsibility. And then finally, obviously the big part at the moment is our sustainability sub-strategy, which Lorna mentioned first thing this afternoon. This strategy is how we're setting out our trajectory over the next 5 years, to make sure that we are actually doing what we're saying we're doing, and working towards quite big and ambitious targets. It's obviously the biggest sub-strategy that we've ever produced, and has been contributed to by a range of different people. But I want to talk a bit about some of the challenges and how this is going to pan out over the next 5 years, hopefully. So within the sub-strategy, there are 13 different priority areas. So these are all quite big and important and diverse. So everything from our different types of emissions, how we teach, what we teach, the research that's going on, how we manage our grounds, our water management, obviously waste and recycling, what we produce and where it goes, how we travel, either on business, people going on research travel, how people commute to our campuses, the food and drink we're serving, our buildings in terms of how sustainable they are, and how we use our spaces, particularly obviously coming out of the pandemic. It's changed somewhat in how we are using our buildings and how much people are coming into our campuses. Finance and procurement focuses particularly on how we're spending our money, who we're spending it with. Are they ethical? Are we sourcing things in the right way? And then finally, our community is around how we engage with people and kind of make sure that everyone's coming on this journey with us. I counted up yesterday, there are 210 deliverables for this strategy, based under 67 objectives and 39 KPIs, which when you kind of look at it that way, it's huge. There is a lot to be achieved over a long period of time. working groups have come up with all these different objectives, and people have different responsibilities. It's not just the sustainability team that are going to be working on these. It's people across the university, as I mentioned, but it's a big challenge, and it's not just about carbon emissions, but using resources better and lowering our impact, and trying to make sure that climate is kind of a focus for people as they work through this. We accept that there is no alternative here. Acting or not acting is catastrophic, so we kind of have no alternatives. We know that these are the things that we have to tackle and that we're passionately working to address now. It is predominantly sort of operational and policy and behaviour change aspects that need to be embedding sustainable thinking into work, but there's huge ranges of things outside that and within even what we're trying to do. But of course, it is not going to be a linear process. There is a lovely straight line of what we are doing now and where we want to be, but we know it's going to be quite a complex route to get there. Like swallowing an alarm clock, it's going to be difficult when we don't underestimate the size of those challenges. It's a wicked problem, which hopefully most people know what that means, but it's so complex in terms of how it's embedded in so many different things. And I think from the different talks today, it really shows that there are so many different strands to climate thinking, activism, environmental change, ecological change, and sustainability, all kind of, it comes into so many different financial, economic, social strands. What we need is joined up thinking, so making sure that we are working with lots of different experts from across the university as well as externally. Collaboration is critical, making sure that we're actually working with the different people who can effect change. And there is no one solution to everything. No one knows all the answers, and we need to get different perspectives to make sure that we're doing things the right way. And money alone isn't always the answer. Some people say, you can just throw as much as you want at it and that's how you fix the problem. But actually, we're trying to kind of change hearts and minds as a big part of this. It's about making people think differently, changing mindsets, and that's how we get where we want to be. So kind of final thought, hopefully people can kind of internalize this a bit. My job isn't about coming to necessarily tell you just what we're doing, but to try and make you think, I'm part of the solution. I'm not necessarily just going to sit here and watch everyone else deal with it. Everyone can be how we change and reach our targets for this strategy and how we reduce the university's impact. On an individual level, you can think about how you travel and the ways that you work, what you eat, what you throw away, and then your journey home again. Think outside the box. There are probably lots of processes and things that you're used to potentially that you think actually aren't always the best way of doing things, but you're not quite sure how you can change them. The answer is just step up and try and do it. We have the power at the university to change things, just from one idea. As Jane said, a student came up with the idea around a petition to declare a climate emergency, and now here we are having declared a climate emergency with a huge strategy that looks at how we move forward. So finally, as always, ending on a little thank you. Thank you everyone who has organised this and for having me. And it's been fantastic to hear all the different conversations that have been had. Obviously, you can keep in touch with what the university is doing, particularly on our social media channels. There's lots of information online. And that's it from me.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks, Daisy. So it's a really good snapshot of what we are doing as a community within the university. So it's very important that while talking about activism, advocacy, and everything, we promote that within our community, and starting with our Essex community, University of Essex community. We are doing it. We started it, and Jane, Daisy, and all our members of the team. So really good that your thoughts. Yeah, so this is a time for the kind of discussion about, and if you're looking at any questions that from the audience. So because of the time that I straight away go into the question, there's a one question from anonymous attendee asking, what role has the union played in advancing the environmental response on campus? What about the student groups? I think this is going to Daisy, I guess. Yeah.
Yes, so we have student union representation on the Climate and Ecological Emergency Advisory Group. So they've been part of the development of the sub-strategy, and there are elements for them to focus on within that. They typically kind of work on their own projects. Hopefully people have seen on Square 4 there's now an eco store, so they're trying to make it much more visible to people, and they do work to try and help reduce their impact and raise awareness to students. I think there's more that can be done in terms of student groups and how they can play a role. There are some societies that are doing work, and we have kind of good relationships with different groups each year, but obviously, as always happens with students, it's a transient population, so we get really good engagement from students, and then usually after the third year they disappear again and we have to start at the beginning and meet the new ones. So we're kind of working through that stage to try and find more people at the moment.
Thanks, Daisy. Yeah, Jane, you want to say something? Yeah, please. Your microphone is muted.
Yeah, I think so. I've been UCU Green Rep for the last 15 months, and Elia Valentini had been the UCU Rep prior to that. So Elia and I were doing, were sharing the role, and this year Elisif Fasmuth is sharing the role with me. The UCU has got a very strong program of backing a sort of Green New Deal and job creation, as well as the transformation of universities, and has promoted campaigns like the petition for the climate emergency, and but also sharing ideas among different green reps across the higher education sector, so that people can learn from different experiences and initiatives and what's worked at different places. So I think so, and the other two campus unions are Unison and Unite, and they also have sort of positions on the climate and ecological emergency advisory group. So I think it's very important that these different perspectives are incorporated. And I think the union was very helpful for the students in getting access to the senior management with the petition. So we were able to discuss it with the UCU president, and she negotiated a space for the petition to be presented to senior management at the joint negotiation committee, which is sort of once a month, I think. So I think the union has an important role in also, we can take things to the committee that have been overlooked or people are concerned about. So that's very important. I think with Daisy, I think more collaboration from the SU would be good, particularly around publicising the climate emergency and events and things would be really useful. But they probably need to have an environmental officer, which they don't have at the moment. So
thanks, Jane. I think the because no other questions, so I just ask a very general a question as a member of this participated in this second panel. So I think I'm trying to connect it to my question to Andrew's point about this green capitalism, and we talk about activism, and then we talked about advocacy and various two different perspectives mainly, and then Jane mentioned about this neoliberalism and different political economies. So how do we promote this community engagement and then balance and engaging with the broader issue of climate and ecological emergency in this current context of, the one side, the global economies, and then the nations are going towards more and more market capitalism and economic development. In the other side, we are trying to pull them back to, more like focus on the, this environment and then protection of the environment, preserving the environment. So how we operate in these two, this sort of a context where these strings are pulled in either ways, especially the emerging economies like countries like, if I say, like China, for example. So this and then the US, sometimes the governments pulling into the other, in the previous administration, they went out from the agreement of UN agreement to environmental protection. How we deal this issue as activists or advocates of this climate emergency? How we address this global political economic issue?
Can I just respond to that,
Please,
Helen?
yeah.
Because one of the things with, I mean, I know that I'm making the case for teaching historical ecology. So a lot of people are paying a lot of attention at the moment to historical ecologies because they reveal what we've already lost, as well as attitudes when people actually did realize things were going wrong. And I see the kind of literature I'm teaching as a form of activism. It certainly was in its day. It was meant to enlist a sense of outrage. But for some reason or other, nothing got done. So, you know, I mentioned that bog pine woodland. The thing about bog pine woodland, which Scott identifies as being an endangered environment and something that we will lose. They were already losing it like 200 years before his own time. But the reason it wasn't valuable was because the timber was not really much good for anything. The trees are stunted, they're very twisted. If you see it, it's a very weird landscape. It has these kind of trees that are all bent and contorted, but they're very high in turpentine. And it could be used to produce turpentine, which was a valuable commodity, but not much else. And that meant when when timber and forestry becomes important, we just lose that. It's gone. And, you know, little pockets of it that are still there now. So I think, you know, introducing students to a kind of adventure fiction, which they can really get quite excited about, and they can. And it's a misnomer that, you know, people don't get excited about this. They do, and they write excellent essays on it. But to think about the things that for some reason or another people identified as endangered, but still got lost. And maybe we have little bits left, or maybe we don't have anything, you know. So I think educating students to look back and see what could have been and wasn't done is helpful in terms of looking to the future.
Thanks, Susan. Tom, please. Yeah.
So you asked about green capitalism and about what, you know, how does it help us address? And I'm not going to repeat the issue earlier about climate emergency. I'm going to speak ecological emergency and another tricky problem that green capitalism presents. And this also, you know, is about looking at utility from a different angle, not the classical angle, but the other angle where those of us who normally have a thing against utility don't when it suits us. So a bit of confirmation bias. And that is the issue about philanthropy. Some of the greatest movements in environmentalism, in fact, probably the greatest exciting things about environmentalism action away from North America, that does it it just does it because they put the money where their mouth is philanthropists investing in restoration. Huge projects in South America, in Europe, in Britain, you know, in the Wild East Anglia. We've got several projects in Northern England and Scotland, loads across Europe. That money doesn't come from a post office bank account. That money comes from capitalism. Like, those people are wealthy because of things that we buy, because of consumerism. But the outcome from it is some really exciting things about rewilding, reintroduction of species, including some of those charismatic ones. I'm not convinced about the wolf, but certainly about, you know, some big things like lynx and their eagles coming back again. And that's actually the symbol for Wild East Anglia. So we've got some, you know, tricky things there because a certain group of people, wealthy people, want to get involved in protecting the environment. We've got these initiatives where they can actually do and achieve some of the things we might have expected our governments to do to reverse biodiversity decline. But the money that's paying for it is furniture, clothing. You see where I'm going? So I think green capitalism is a question on its own. I think capitalism still, there's monies and profits out there that can be put to good uses. It's that classic issue. It can be put to good uses, but funding those good uses, there are other models. The US does this without capitalism. People pay their taxes and pay permits to use these sites, and that gets the job done. So we can maybe learn a non-capitalist approach, but at the moment, some of the most exciting things that nature writers are writing about is coming from capitalism.
Thanks, Tom. And Jane, you want to add something into that? Yes, please. Jane, yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the key challenges is to have a just transition, and how we combine that with the extraction of wealth from large sections of the population and the accumulation of wealth by a very small number of individuals. I mean, we've seen a very dramatic rise in the number of millionaires and billionaires in the last 20 years. I mean, I haven't got the exact figures, but you know, there's a danger that we restore nature, but we continue to degrade the environments and everyday well-being of the poor, the not so poor. And so that, in a sense, is the real challenge. And I take Tom's point that this money is being invested now, but I think that system where we're having this extraordinary level of wealth accumulation at the expense of workers and you know, people's labor, basically, is really it comes from, is something that has to be addressed. And that's where the kind of notion of a just transition, and it's not something you can do overnight. The Scottish government's got a very interesting just transition committee where they're kind of looking at how, you know, switching from fossil fuels to green energy, talking, and they're actually going around talking to different sectors in the economy. How you shift from large for-profit corporations, which are basically extracting wealth, to local wealth creation schemes. There's lots of experiments going on around that, and actually integrating. So, for example, Cleveland and the Preston model is something that some of you may have heard about, where you start to have large local organizations which are actually spending a lot of money, invest in local companies, which are often cooperatives, which are in the new green sectors. So there's a lot of challenges, and you know, the problem with the extremely wealthy and their philanthropy may be a good short-term fix. And some of these models are really important, the rewilding models. But I think, you know, that how we get to that more just economy and society is really the key issue.
Thanks, Jane. And is anyone else want to contribute? Otherwise, I think it's a long, yeah. Okay, Susan. Yeah.
Can I just add a quick
please.
point about rewilding and philanthropy? I mean, rewilding is obviously something that contributes to rebuilding environments, but it's very hubristic of us to think that we can actually really rewild an area, because we never really know fully what has gone, and you never get a situation where the entire ecology of a place has been brought back. In fact, one of the things that's most often missing is people. People were part of the developing ecologies of those regions, but it's not very often that you know that there's an attempt to recreate a human community that has been lost. And I would take as an example here North American national parks, where you know there's an attempt to leave things very often, you know, wildfire burnt areas to regenerate themselves. But, you know, they don't bring back into those areas communities of people that lived on them for whole centuries and millennia. So you know, you can never really quite create what was there before, and you only ever have a partial rewilding. Now, I know, you know that's a difficult problem to reconcile, but nevertheless, it is a problem.
Yeah. Okay, Jane. Yeah, 1 minute. Yeah. Okay.
Come back there, because I do think that actually the rewilding projects they really are a source of hope. And I think particularly for non-scientists, the way nature can come back, okay, it's not necessarily the way it was. I mean, I don't know what Tom thinks about this, but as the, you know, the marine ecologist here, and obviously it's no substitute for also looking at agricultural practices and use of pesticides and so on. But in a sense, it does show this kind of the strength of natural processes when we stand back and let them get on, let species get on with things.
I really do have to go, but this is such an important point to make, that it is, yes, absolutely. And actually, you could take that position, philosophical position, about this entire debate. The planet's okay. Yes. It's us that are screwed. Yeah. And we need to, take that step back with rewilding as well, and say that, rewilding has a lot of assumptions and a lot of promises that aren't always backed up by evidence and science. But that might not matter. If someone really wants to remove all the drivers of current agriculture and have biodiversity, that's fine. Let's have that biodiversity. But we shouldn't make promises about what it's going to achieve. We can't say, if we get back lynx, that will all of a sudden mean that marsh tits will reverse from extinction. And, if we get back wolves, the deers will decline. There's a lot of people writing about this. And frankly, if you don't mind me saying so, recorded, it's bollocks. And the dangers is that it is eco-populism. It's very common at the moment, ecological populism, and people are buying into it. And that becomes activism. And that's when activism becomes dangerous. But rewilding per se, but removing drivers and saying, let's remove the agricultural drivers. Let's remove the building drivers, like building in floodplains that we've just done on campus again. Let's remove those drivers and see what happens. That side of rewilding, I think that should be welcomed.
Okay, thank you very much for all of your excellent comments and this conversation. We have to continue. So I thank Tom, Jane, Susan, and Daisy for your brilliant talks and stimulating and really fruitful. And I think this conversation about this green capitalism, and also, I'm very much experiencing with my research in these poor countries and poverty, and people connect with the sort of forests and fishing, and then their livelihood, changing them into alternative livelihoods. So there's a market, moral, and then the green, all these three sort of, not just three, at least to start with. So the transition, we need to find the balance in all that, because we can't let poor people and say, okay, stop eating and don't stop deforesting. So what they would do, these things we need to solve in very different ways. It's a challenge. So there's no one solution, and we have to engage as researchers and activists and advocates on this issue. So thank you very much for everyone for your participation and for your presentations. And I'm sure all the participants have enjoyed so much. And then 2 centers, and then the Katja for organizing this thing, and Jude for initiating and coordinating by emails, and Chamin, our CES seminar organizer, for assisting them. So thank you very much. And Andrew, thanks for sharing leading the first session. Thank you very much. I conclude this our
thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.